Good evening to my sisters and my brothers. I'm Dr. Tait, pastor of the Village Church. Welcome to our institute that we have on Wednesdays, and pray that you've had a wonderful day. And thank you for joining us for our spiritual and cultural institute. Here we ask that you to take the opportunity to like and share our time together, invite some people to join us. Uh, and to be a part of this experience this evening. And we just pray that you spread the word. Good evening to you, Elder Jackie, and anybody else who's joining us. Thank you so much. And these are the people I can see. And so thank you for joining and being a part. I'm grateful for that. And so hopefully you've had a good day, a blessed day. And it's getting cold, and at least I think we had a little warmer weather today here in DC, and some of the snow is melting, and so we are grateful for that. So I'm gonna give people an opportunity to join us and be a part. Also to remind you of our theme for this year, which is Faith Beyond Survival. Is also sort of a theme that we are drawing on in this 12-week institute. And so, and definitely we need to be aware of all things that are going on, and particularly as African American people. I was reading today, listening to the news, that Haitian people have protections, well, they've had protections for a moment here in this government, and the Trump administration has been trying to end those protected status for Haitians. And so there's roughly 350,000 Haitians in the U.S. through legal status because of natural disasters and armed conflict in their home country. And so they're fighting for the extension of that because, to go back home would be a detriment to many of those. So a federal judge on Monday rejected Trump's administration to attempt the temporary protected administration status of hundreds of thousands of Haitians living in America. And so we need to be aware of this because, it's because it got stopped one time doesn't mean that the Trump administration is going to stop fighting to deport Haitians. And so that's every African American should be awake now because Haitians, they look like us. And so, with racial profiling, and now with ICE having, um, they don't have to have a search warrant um, or read you your rights. And so we have to, find ways to survive right now. And so make sure that you have a valid ID on you. If you were asked by ICE, I know it shouldn't be this way, but we want to stay alive. So try to remain calm and give them what they're asking for. And the thing is, we have to organize. It's very important that we organize. We need to be a part of groups that are organizing, and it's important that we make sure that we do that, protect ourselves, and protect each other. So we need to, not necessarily be afraid, but we need to be organized and be aware and stay woke and understand what's going on, what is actually happening in our country, and things that affect us directly, but also things that affect other people that indirectly affect us or directly affect us. So we need to stay vigilant, stay alert, and keep your wits about you. So we're going to get started tonight, and I pray that you have your Bible or even something to write with, that you just be plugged in. And then just take the opportunity because not a lot of us are on now. But take the opportunity to like and share, invite other people on, and just try to get people to hear. People often say they want to hear an alternative um, message than the ones that they're hearing. And so we're here not necessarily just to have an alternative, but we're here to not just give you a gospel that's in sync with the empire, that's in sync with white supremacy and racist kind of understanding, but here to give you a liberating word, a word of hope, teaching that helps you to perhaps open your eyes to ask questions. Yes, ask questions even of your own faith. And so we pray that you would invite other people. This in the way of announcement. We want to continue to pray for Pastor Fears, Pastor Patty Fears, her mother funeral service, a homegoing service will be on this coming Friday. So we want to pray for her. And we will be at her church on Sunday, this coming Sunday, for our in-person worship at 10. So those persons who live in the area will be there at 10 o'clock at 5605 Colorado Avenue Northwest. And so we just ask that you will pray for her family during this time of bereavement, during this time of grief and loss, that you would just lift them up in prayer, lift her up in prayer in particular. All right. So the text I want to lift up tonight, and is from Exodus. Before I read it, I do want to have a word of prayer. Then I'll read the text. God, thank you for giving us this time to study, to share, to be together wherever we may be. Through technology, we're able to reach out to people in different places. And we just pray, God, that you will open up these avenues so people can hear um, the message, the teaching, and they can be inspired. And perhaps they'll have more questions than answers. But God, we pray that this will help them to realize that you are an amazing God, and a God that's not afraid of us to think outside of the traditions, think outside of ways that have sometimes kept us in bondage, and also to grow in our understanding of our connection to you and to each other. And this is my prayer in your Son's name, Jesus the Christ. Amen. So the text I want to read tonight is from Exodus, the Old Testament. We've been doing a lot of work. This is our third week, and on this fourth day of February, and we're looking at this Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 12, and it's reading from the Good News translation of the Bible. This is one day while Moses was taking care of the sheep and goats of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock across the desert and came to Sinai, the holy mountain. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him as a flame coming from the middle of a bush. Moses saw that the bush was on fire, but that it was not burning up. This is strange, he thought. Why isn't the bush burning up? I will get closer to see. And when the Lord saw Moses was coming closer, he called to him from the middle of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. He answered, yes, here I am. And God said, do not come any closer. Take off your sandals because you are standing on holy ground. I am the God of your ancestors, see that? God of your ancestors, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Moses covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. And then the Lord said, I've seen how cruelly my people are being treated in Egypt. I've heard them cry out to be rescued from their slave drivers. I know all about their suffering, and I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and to bring them out of Egypt to a spacious land, one which is rich and fertile, and in which the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites now live. I have indeed heard the cry of my people. I see how the Egyptians are oppressing them. And now I'm sending you to the king of Egypt so that you can lead my people out of his country. And Moses says, God, I am nobody. How can I go to the king and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? God answered, I will be with you. And when you bring the people out of Egypt, you will worship me on this mountain. And that will be proof that I have sent you. So let's just look at this. And tonight, if I would just, this is week number 3, and I try to give each week a sort of a theme and that we kind of work from, even though our overall theme is based on our theme for the year, which is faith beyond survival. But tonight, for this week 3, we kind of want to focus in Exodus as memory, not myth. Memory. That's why memory is so important. This is Black History Month, of course. And that's why it's important to remember history, even when it's trying to be erased from our schools. And even some of our churches, they have to go back to start teaching Black history in the homes. And there's a reason why the oppressor doesn't want people to remember their history, because they will have nothing to pull from. They will have nothing to say that happened then and it's still happening and it needs to be corrected. You have no reference points. Then you sometimes will normalize situations because you think this is the normal way to do it. But when you understand history, you realize that oppression is nothing normal about it. There's nothing good about it. And people have to be held accountable for what they've done. And that's another reason why oppressors don't want you to remember your history, because at some point they will have to be held accountable for the injustices and the inhuman way they've treated people and the things that they've done. And so when we start to look at this text tonight, um, it's interesting that Moses, he was shepherding the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro. And remember, this text that says Jethro, he was a priest of Midian. And of course, he's at and he led the flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Also, Horeb is also referred to as Mount Sinai. It's the same mountain with 2 different names. And so let's just look at it for a moment here. So Moses is in Midian. He's not in Egypt. He is not in the palace. Remember, he had grown up in Pharaoh's house. And when he left, he was 40 years old. So for 40 years, he lived in the palace. But he's not in the palace now. He's not even among his own people. Now, his people are the Hebrew people. But you could also say that he's part of the Egyptian, because he grew up in Pharaoh's house and go to school and get tutored and all of that kind of stuff. You're running around, for the longest time, up to 40 years, he was living like an Egyptian. And then he's in Midian now. Midian is a place of exile for him. It's a refuge place. It's survival after his moral rupture, because he had murdered an Egyptian. He was defending another Hebrew person, and he murdered him. So Moses fled Egypt after realizing that the empire would never let him belong, not as a Hebrew, and not as a liberator, of course, and not as conscious. So Midian is where fugitives go when power has made you unsafe. And we know Shakata Shakur, we know that she fled America because dealing with all of the things that fall out from her life in America and being accused of murdering a cop, she had to live in exile in Cuba and never had the opportunity to return. And so we see that even in modern times, people sometimes they have to be other places because they can't stay where the empire is and where the empire has great reach. So you said, why does this matter? Because God does not first speak to Moses in power, but in displacement. And that happens to many of us when we really sort of hear God in whatever way that is, or become conscious that there is a God. A lot of times that happens when we are in places where we've been displaced, or situations where we've had to deal with struggle and difficulty. And then, oftentimes people say, well, you find people find God in prison. And that's true. Some people do, and some people are genuine. But he had been displaced. And sometimes that happens when people come to a different understanding and awareness of themselves and their surroundings. They develop a different kind of consciousness. So Moses is in the wilderness, and the text says that Moses led the flock beyond the wilderness. The Hebrew imagination treats the wilderness as a space of stripping. So you can imagine Moses is going through this kind of stripping process of who he thought he was, a place of unlearning. And even in context in which we're in some of my teaching is not to throw Christianity out, but sometimes we need to unlearn some things that we have learned about our Christian faith that were not necessarily correct, but more detrimental, keeping us from who we are and who we can be. Growing up in the church, a lot of times we were taught to not question the pastor, not question anything because you were questioning God. Well, that's incorrect, because you have questions. And if you go back and read your own Bible, you can just take the example of Job. He had questions. He was not struck down for his questions. He was able to question God, and at some point in that story, he gets some answers, and at some points he may not have gotten the answers that he was looking for. But there was nothing wrong with him asking questions. And then there's some things that we have learned, and like Moses, you have this a space of unlearning. So this wilderness is a place of unlearning, and also it's a space where sort of false identities fall apart. And that's that can happen. For instance, uh, if your identity was tied to where you worked, or your profession, and then all of a sudden you had to give that up, then you know that once you're out of that profession, who are you? Yeah, who then you are? Yeah, I'm seeing my cousins coming in, Terry Tait and Nate Tait. Glad to have you. And Elder Jack, if it's somebody else I mentioned, you can you can type it in the comment line, and I can post it. But thank you all for coming in. Yeah, and that's my cousin Nate, my first cousin. That's my man, Nate the Skate. So wilderness is really not a punishment. It's really not a punishment, and I think it's difficult because when you're in a wilderness, when you're in a place of trying to find yourself, when you're in a place that seems to be outside of the norm for how you function, when you're in a place that is stripping you, stripping away certain things in your life, a place of unlearning, a space, a space where your false identities fall apart. It can be very challenging. It's and very difficult. And so it's sort of preparation through dislocation is what's happening. And sometimes that happens. We are prepared through our dislocation. Preparation can definitely happen there. Some people actually do it intentionally, where they go to a silent retreat, or they take a sabbatical and they go away to a remote place to deplug and take away, not be on the cell phone and all of those kind of things, and not have a lot of outside noise, and to actually be able to prepare for what they need to prepare for. Remember when Jesus was baptized in the Jordan, and God said that this is my son whom I'm well pleased. He's first, before he actually started ministry, he went straight to the wilderness. And that's an interesting thing. And here is this teacher, this man, this Messiah, and his first move, he's instructed, he's going to the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, no food, no drink, and he is also tempted, because the wilderness it either will break you or it will make you. So Moses is a former prince now working as a shepherd. What a come down, caring for animals and not commanding people, what he had been doing for most of his life. And this is downward mobility before his calling comes into place. And sometimes, things are happening to us and we think they're detrimental. Sometimes it could be a setup for us to really become the best selves that we possibly can become in whatever that calling could be. It's not always about the ministry. People always think it's, but it could be a calling to work in your community. It could be a calling to um, be a better supervisor. Whatever that call on your life may be. So Moses is at the mountain Horeb. The mountain of God is called a valley. The text names the place Horeb, and Horeb later becomes, as I told you earlier, in Sinai, the place of the covenant, the law, and the community formation. That's where the Hebrew people will come to after they come out of bondage in Egypt. And but here's the key insight: Horeb is sacred before a Hebrew people ever arrived. This is important. Before these Hebrew people ever came to this mountain was sacred. It was a sacred place. Remember, Jethro was a priest. So, we always want to put labels on people, what denomination they are. Are they Christian? Are they Hebrew? Are they whatever? But it said he was a priest. And I'm pretty sure, because Moses spent some time there, 40 years before he returned, that he learned some things from Jethro, who was a priest before Moses became a priest. So there's no, so these Hebrew people, there's no nation yet, no law yet. They don't have a Torah, the first five books of the Bible. They don't have anything there. They don't have no Bible then, no Exodus yet, which tells us something crucial, that God's presence is not dependent on on the Hebrew people's power and in Egypt's recognition or institutional religion. God meets Moses before the movement and not after it succeeds, but before. Why does this matter theologically? Because Moses is called outside of the empire, outside of the Egyptian empire. He is outside of the community, he is outside of the Egyptian community, and he's certainly outside of the Hebrew community. And he's outside the center. He's no longer the center of attention. And yet God says, I've seen, I've heard, and I've come down. And this is the pattern. I've seen, I've heard, and I've come down. So this humanizes God to us because we know this is a God who can hear, and this is God who can see, and it's saying coming down. That image for me is problematic because I don't think God needs to come down from anywhere. But that's how these people were understanding God, because God was already there. God didn't need to come down from anywhere. God is always present. But their understanding in the reading of this text, that's how they understood that God was coming down from them from somewhere. And my understanding of God is always here. God doesn't need to come down from anywhere because God is omnipresent. God is everywhere at the same time. So God doesn't need to come down. God is already present. So this is a pattern. God does not begin liberation in palaces. In necessarily, you never see liberation beginning in the Oval Office or in the Senate or House of Representatives. But liberation, if you study history, doesn't begin in these places, so-called of power and legislatures, in places of comfort, in boardrooms or at a stadium. But God begins liberation in exile spaces and forgotten spaces and overlooked spaces. Um, and um, and then Moses was sent back to these enslaved Hebrews. I want you to get this as I try to finish this lesson up, they were enslaved Hebrews. They were not yet Israelites. All right. They were enslaved Hebrews, and they're living the same reality that Moses once lived. It's important that remember that understanding, that sometimes we conflate these two terms and think Israelites and Hebrews are the same, and they're not. They're Hebrew people. They've overlooked, misunderstood, considered a problem, named an inconvenience. And of course, we can look at our own history. That's why there was a what they called a slave Bible, because they took out the book of Exodus. We didn't allow us to read anything that alluded to freedom or people being oppressed and being freed by this God, because they wanted you to think the enslavers and Europeans who came, the slaves, the plantation owners with their plantation understanding and theology, their way of understanding God, that somehow enslaving African people, our ancestors, was something sent from God, and that was a pure lie. So if you take out Exodus, or you create a Bible that takes out narratives that allude to freedom from oppressive systems and oppressive people, then you create this sort of what I call plantation theology. But if you read this Exodus story, any group that reads it, and even in the New Testament, the Song of Mary, like some municipalities and countries wouldn't allow her song, because Mary was talking about how God was dealing with the oppressed even in her day, and how God looked down on her as a lowly person but lifted her up. And so when you read this stuff, there's no way in the world you could be going to a church who is telling you that the only way you can hear the gospel if it's a white man standing in front of you and preaching it to you. And that if you listen to a black preacher, and I'm not just making this up, I told you this on Sunday, that somehow he's not preaching the gospel, he's heretical. And so when you hear this stuff, because God didn't call us to be Americans, God didn't call us to be Democrats or Republicans, and we vote these ways. These are things that we do. And of course, we should look at how these policies affect other people. If they're unjust, I don't care if you're Democrat or Republican, then we shouldn't be voting for things or supporting stuff that's not just. That's harming other people. I don't care where they're from. We are all God's people. And of course, we have a unique story in this country, in this Black History Month, because we spent 250 years in slavery. Our ancestors did. And with 250 years. And there's also things that has happened subsequently since the so-called ending of slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation. But we know that it just hasn't been that easy. Even when busing was outlawed, some states still took 2, 3, 4 years, 5 and longer to have busing where it was integrated. And then they closed schools and did all kinds of stuff and started private schools, like Jerry Falwell was head of the Moore majority, and there were others like him. They couldn't just come out and say that, they were racist or they didn't like black folks. They just did stuff that showed us who they were. So they started Christian schools, call them Christian, and whether it was whatever the schools were. And sometimes, yes, they let a few black folks in. And unfortunately, those black folks who went into those schools, their minds, unfortunately, have been, what can I say? Their thinking is more like the plantation owner than someone who is freed in their thinking. That's a teaching December for another day. So historical erasure, this is the same dynamic we named last week. And when rulers want to control, they first erase memory of contribution, memory of identity. That's why I was talking about, it's not a matter of, African people or people of African descent, we call ourselves black or colored or Negro, that we think we are superior to. We're not playing that game. It's not a superior. It's just understanding who we are and embracing that. I'm not, I don't need to deny who I am as an African American to be a Christian. No, who I am informs my Christianity. I was born in this skin, and I was born this way, and I don't need to deny it. Some people teach that somehow when you become a Christian, you deny all of your identity. No, and it's not a matter of me or a group being better. It's just embracing who we are. And my embracing of who I am is not a detriment to who you are. And if it is, then something's wrong with it. That's why white nationalism, white supremacy is not what we look for. We're not looking for black supremacy. We're looking to be recognized, and we're going to recognize ourselves first, because we can't wait for other people to recognize us. But we don't think that we're superior. We just know that we've been made in the image and likeness of God, and we're not taking a back seat to anybody. That's all. And we're not ignorant, we're not dumb, we're not lazy. All of these labels that have been put on us in this culture and even the meritocracy thing that if you work hard enough, you succeed. We know that's not true because you're not even dealing with all the barriers that people have to make. And when we do make it, and then we do all the stuff that you say that we have to do, then you turn around and still say that something's wrong with us. So we don't even want to play that game anymore. We're just going to be who God created us to be. And so we know rulers who want to control, they first erase memory, memory of contribution, memory of identity, and memory of promise. Promise what God has promised. So Pharaoh erased Joseph. Because, he erased what Joseph was doing. America erases Black history. Matter of fact, we see that happening around the country. We know this is Black History Month, but there are many contributions that our people have made, and this country would not have the wealth that it has if it didn't have the free and forced labor of African people for all these years. 250 years and more than that. And still going on today. And listen, God does God's deepest work, not at the center of power, but at the margins of memory. Let me say that again. God does God's deepest work, not at the center of power, but at the margins of memory. So Moses is not in Egypt, and God calls him. He's in Midian. He's in the wilderness. He's at Horeb, and God tells us where liberation always begins. Now I want to go back for a moment, just for a few minutes, and I want to come back to how naming people properly is often overlooked and understated. But those who name and or rename often have well thought out intentions, such as the renaming of the Kennedy Center, and we can unpack that and what that actually means, and how that just happens. And people think that's nothing, but it's important to note, who's doing the renaming and why, and what are they trying to accomplish. So in Exodus chapters 1 through 3, the people in bondage are not yet Israelites, even though sometimes in teachings people will say they'll use the term Israelite or they use the term Jews. No, in the covenantal and national and later political sense, they are enslaved Hebrews. There's a distinction. This distinction is critical. So the Hebrews is not a nation state yet. They're not a nation state. They're not a land-holding people. They're not even a religious polity yet. It is a people, loosely federated, if you will. That they are a laboring population that's in Egypt. And I just throw this in here, and it's something when you think about, but even Egyptians don't necessarily have a history of them. So that's question, this narrative, where did it come from? And that's good for us to have that question. It doesn't mean it didn't exist, but the Egyptians on this side, they have no history of these people. All right, that's something for us to think about. But the story is good; it's instructive, right? So they are a laboring population. They're ethnic group that is underclass, and has nothing to do with race, because race didn't even exist at the time in terms of how, how we look at race, and how race is often interpreted. It was just not a thing. Um, and race is something very, very new in terms of 16th century. And of course, America is fixated on putting people in categories and racializing them. And the truth of the matter, in this Exodus narrative, the Egyptians are Africans and Hebrew people are Africans. The conflict is not racial in color conscious sense, because they didn't have that. They didn't think like we think today. Both groups lived on the African continent. Remember, Egypt is in Africa. And both would have range across similar phenotypes, and both participate in ancient African cultures, economics, even religious worlds. When you go back and read about how they were birthing the children, and Shipra and Puah, who the midwives, and they said the Hebrew women went on stools. When you go back and study, even in African history and even today, how African women had babies, they had them on stools. They were not laying down like today with an epidural in their bed. No, they were on stools, right? So these are both African people, And the text never describes Pharaoh enslaving Hebrew people because of the color of their skin. Never. You don't read that in the text at all. But we like to do that. And to be honest, and I don't have time to deal with it tonight, but my mentor and friend, Dr. Felder, he said then we would have, because these are African people, we would have to talk about how we as African people treat each other, what we do to each other. so, um, and so the Hebrews, they are a foreign laboring population of people with a distinct lineage and communal identity, economically useful but politically vulnerable, and perceived as numerous, therefore threatening, because their numbers have grown, their population. This is not xenophobia. This is xenophobia. This is class exploitation. This is imperial control, not white supremacy in this text. So this is xenophobia, and it is class exploitation, and it's imperial control, not white supremacy. This has nothing to do with black and white, even though we've used this story in terms of our own context to get out of white supremacy deafening and destructive laws that have hurt African American people. But Pharaoh's fear is not they are darker, that they are black. Pharaoh's fear is that there are many and not fully under our control. That's his fear. And that's what we have to understand. And so when we understand the bridge to American racialization, here's where the connection does belong. While the Hebrews were racialized in Exodus, as we talk, but African descended people and African Americans were racialized deliberately. So in European Christianity and colonial law invented racial categories, tied them to skin color, baptized them in with theology, and enforced them with violence. There is a different system built for a different empire. But the pattern of oppression remains consistent. Erase history or memory, control labor, criminalize growth. We see that when many of our African American women were sterilized. And this is not this 20 years ago. There's a documentary I just read about prisons in California sterilizing black women in prison, black and brown women, without their permission, and then sanctified domination. So this is what we need to understand. I've got to quit here in a minute, but I want to make sure I make that point. So when we read these texts, that we don't jump to saying that these people, these Hebrew people, are modern day Jews. All right, because that's not the truth. They use these stories too, but it doesn't mean that what we're seeing over in Israel is the representative of what happened in the Bible. And sometimes, particularly with white evangelicals and even some black pastors, they want to say these are the same people, and that's not necessarily true. And also what they're doing in the name of scriptures in terms of what they're doing to the Palestinian people, Palestinian children, and the genocide that's happened there is not biblical. That is not, to me, in my perspective, that's not God. And that's not God. And those are things we need to be very, very careful of. And so in this sort of, and I'm trying to finish up here, so this modern racial ideology, especially the idea that humanity is divided into biological fixed races ranked by value, emerges in the early modern Europe, particularly with the Enlightenment era thinkers such as Francois Brunel in the 17th century. That's Francois Brunel, F-A-F-A-F-R-A-C O-I-S, and his last name is B-R-N-I-E-R, in the 17th century, and later racial science came from this system was designed to justify colonial expansion, rationalize enslavement, and assign moral and intellectual value to skin color. And see, this, and so that worldview does not exist in the ancient world. So we must not project so out American and European racial categories backward onto the text. And that's basically what I'm trying to say. So tonight, I want us to understand that the Exodus memory is not myth. What was happening there, what was happening to these people, what was going on is not myth, it's memory. And I have to stop there tonight. I hope you've gotten something out of this. And I hope you've gotten something out of this tonight. There's so much we can learn, but I just remember that this story is helpful for us to understand that this is the God that we serve is a God that seems to be always on the side of people who are being oppressed and people who are being disenfranchised. And that's something that flies in the face of individualism, capitalism, and exploitation of people in the 21st century. And even going back to 16th century, 15th century, and of course 1619 when our African ancestors first came here in terms of the enslavement piece, is just instructive for us. All right, let me just share with you. Thank you all for just supporting the village whenever you can through your tithes, your offerings, whatever you give. We're appreciative, seriously. And if you're unable, don't worry about it. We're just glad that you're able to come to be a part of the teachings that we do at the Institute, or to be a part of our services. But for those of you who practice the 10-10-80 principle, it's a principle. It's not, you have to do it. It's not by law. It's not by compulsion. You're not going to hell if you don't tithe. It is you give out of a heart of love, a heart that's cheerful, and a heart that wants to support, and that's it. And so when you do that, we teach this principle that you tithe 10% of your income, take the other 10% and tithe it to yourself, create a rainy day fund, and then learn to live off 80% or less. And we appreciate that. Thank you all for these comments. I appreciate it. And so if you do that, then you give the Giveify or the Cash App. And so I love you all's comments, and I wish I had more time, but I try to keep it within about a half an hour, no more than 40 minutes, so we can get out of here. But I appreciate you all support. Don't forget Sunday. We're still, even though we're having in-person worship, you'll still be able to see us online. We'll have our full service, and we just want to thank y'all and keep us in prayer. Continue to pray for my sister Elder Jackie. She lost her husband, and just a wonderful Deacon Charlie was just a wonderful man. Pray for each other, and let's stay connected, okay? And listen, I want to just have a closing prayer. God, I thank you for everybody who's been on tonight, my family, my cousins, and just all the persons who've joined us. Pray for their health. Pray for um, their healing. We pray, God, for their sustainability, their finances, and other kinds of things. We also pray, God, you allow us to have friends and other people around us, allies that are justice oriented, not just persons that don't have questions, but persons that want to see justice for everyone, that want to see people treated fairly. And this is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Look, have a wonderful and blessed evening. God bless.